It is sad when mistreatment and abuse and neglect and murder against Indian people becomes common. This is where it started, and this is where it's going to end.
I talk to Crazy Horse and Little Crow, Little Six and Sitting Bull. You can hear the war cry, we ain't crying wolf. It's still a good day to tie when you...
And welcome to the Future Generations Podcast. I'm Pablo Mancias.
And I'm KP.
And we're dedicated to uplifting Indigenous voices and creating a community for growth, healing, and learning. And today's topic is going to be appropriation versus appreciation.
Yes, so we've heard a lot of conversations around both of these topics. Specifically, I've heard it a lot in the online community. So I just wanted to make a distinction about what each of it is. So appreciation is when someone seeks to understand and learn about another culture. It's in an effort to broaden their perspective and connect with others cross-culturally. And appropriation is simply taking one aspect of your culture that is not your own and using it for your own personal interest.
Yeah, and in the work that I've been doing, the environmental work I've been doing, there's been this need to define what businesses are good for communities and what aren't. And the definitions have been brought up as extractive businesses and restorative businesses. And extractive business is one that takes resources and minerals from stuff and it doesn't put anything back into the community and kind of leaves those areas desolate afterwards. They call them sacrifice zones. When we talk about appropriation and appreciation, a good way to think of it is kind of that analogy, whereas appropriation is more of an extractive thing. It's they're taking aspects of a culture and they're not really doing anything to give back to it. It's just taking it for your own need and use, and it's not really, I want to say, uplifting or respecting in a lot of ways the community and where it came from. Whereas appreciation is a lot more humility, a lot more listening,
Mm-hmm.
and stepping up by stepping back, because again, this isn't your culture, your group, so you have to have a certain amount of respect that I've seen in my own experience, especially to be entrusted with some of these things, because they're considered gifts. They're not rights. They have to be earned. It's a right to pass down the knowledge in a good way, but at the end of the day, they're gifts for all of us and they need to be respected that way. So, for instance, you see people wearing, headdresses. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of people wear turquoise, and, burning sage, for instance, has
Mm-hmm.
become a cleansing practice done by everybody, but they don't have a teaching with it that comes, passed down through generations. And that's one of the most important things, is because it's been passed down by generations. In some cases, it's the only surviving aspect
The culture.
of the culture to pass
Mm-hmm.
down. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Immediately, I thought of those music festivals, Coachella.
Hmm.
Fashion plays a big role in those music festivals, and a lot of people appropriated indigenous fashion, and they didn't realize that by wearing whether it was feathers or items that would be considered disrespectful to a cultural community, they couldn't see their mistake in that, right?
Right.
And
And I have an interesting story about that,
mm-hmm.
because back in, I want to say, 2015, there was a band that came to San Antonio play, the Flaming Lips, and the singer had been, years before, had been in a controversy involving the governor of Oklahoma's daughter, which he is from Oklahoma too, the singer from the Flaming Lips. And she wore a headdress at Coachella or some music festival
Mm-hmm.
and was criticized for it on social media.
Mm-hmm.
It's being said that she was appropriating a culture and that it was disrespectful. And there was a lot of calls to confront her about it from groups like the American Indian Movement. And after that happened, I guess as a way of reacting to it, the singer from the Flaming Lips ended up putting a headdress on his dog and taking a picture of it, just to
Oh, wow.
make people seem like your concern is dumb.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of these people who are, reacting to her doing this, they're infringing on her freedom of speech, kind of thing, is the energy you would get from his defensiveness afterwards, because he, like her, was also criticized for his actions
Mm-hmm.
and was asked to apologize, for what he was doing by the American Indian Movement. So
Mm-hmm.
He did not respond to any of the groups that were trying to hold him accountable, and he ended up apologizing on a radio station. But his apology was really backhanded. It was like, I can't control what my fans do, and I'm not going to tell them they can't, express themselves in whatever ways they want to, which kind of takes that. That's not an apology.
That isn't an
That isn't an
apology.
apology at all. And
That's not taking any accountability for the people that were hurt, right?
Right.
That's not taking any accountability for the actions, whether it was done with the correct intention or not. An apology, you have to like take into account the harm that was caused. And also, like you mentioned, sometimes these gifts are the only thing passed down to communities, marginalized communities, right? And as a way of survival, we have to be protective over them, right? Because we don't know if people are coming with the right mindset, like you said, out of humility, with respect. When it comes to, especially like spirituality, I feel has become very trendy online.
It's commodified too.
Yes. And the dangers with this, right, is that because it's become really trendy, elders' voices are not uplifted, right? And so when it comes to any sort of gift or knowledge, I feel like elders' voices need to be uplifted because they have that wisdom and experience, as opposed to anyone that might be doing it as a trend. You don't know where they're getting that knowledge from.
Right.
There are a lot of people with cults. There are a lot of people that have been put in unsafe situations, right? Even by going to sweat lodges, right, that were ran by people
Probably
that
didn't really know what they were doing, right?
Yeah, with that mentality. So I think that's why this conversation of appreciation and appropriation has been so popular online, because more than anything, I think the Native community is willing to speak about these subjects as long as it's coming from the right voice. So, where is the source coming from? Is it coming from an elder? Is it coming from a wise perspective? Make sure that it's not a trend, and more importantly, that you're safe.
Right, right, right. And I think also with that, there's this tendency when people are trying to learn these things that, like, I can learn about this culture and this religion on another continent by reading in a book. Like, why is it a problem that you know, why is it a problem that I'm learning this, or not necessarily learning, but trying to extract these practices without any reciprocity, like, what am I doing? How did I earn this?
Exactly.
Yeah, how did I earn this? That's the question when it comes to appropriation versus appreciation. And again, we have a lot of resources that we're going to put in the description for the video here on YouTube, so you can go to those links and access some of that stuff. But when KP says things like, this is the only thing that we have to pass down, it's because in history, when, people of color, Native people, and Black people have acquired wealth and upward mobility in this country, it has been taken from us, like physically, through violence, physical force. Black Wall Street, the Osage tribe, and what happened to them after they were pushed into an area with a lot of oil money. And they ended up buying cars and building mansions, and they started to get killed because of it.
We have a good article to reference with this, in which, we were discussing about the impact of stealing. I guess stealing is not even like the right word I want to use. Basically, taking the wealth or colonizing.
Robbing.
The wealth that Native communities had, right? And in this particular tribe, it was for their oil money. And so when you take the wealth from marginalized groups and then you want to take their cultural beliefs as well, then you'll understand why people are so protective about it. And we have an audio.
Yeah, let's hear that audio clip.
Generations ago, the Osage Indian Nation was forced to move. Not for the first time, white settlers pushed them off their land in the 1800s. The writer David Grann sees in that move the start of an astonishing and tragic story.
When they were being driven off their land in Kansas, they didn't know where to go. And an Osage chief stood up and he said, we should go to this area that would later become Northeast Oklahoma because it's rocky and infertile, and the white man will finally leave us alone.
It turned out the Osage had chosen land that was rich in oil. In the early 20th century, members of this beaten-down Indian nation grew spectacularly wealthy. They bought cars, They built mansions. They made so much oil money that the government began appointing white guardians to help the Indians spend it. And then the Osage started to be killed.
What did you think of that last sentence or before it was talking
The
about that those
government.
sage, yeah, that they appointed settlers to manage the money?
Yeah,
How did
I
that
want
make you feel?
that just to me that hits me with the parentalism over Native American culture by the government since the creation of the BIA. I mean, that still happens today. You know, with
Mm-hmm.
casinos, like you have these corporations who help, quote unquote, help these tribes create their casinos,
Mm-hmm.
and they're usually deals that like don't favor the tribes as much, and I think some of them have gotten smarter over time, but like that's always been a part of the colonization and assimilation of native people is that parentalism. Oh, well, let me show you what to do, like with this,
Mm-hmm.
since you don't have this in your culture, let me show you what you need to do with this. Like we don't know how to operate what our
Exactly.
own lives and wealth.
It goes back to infantilizing
Yeah,
us,
yeah,
right?
infantilizing, yeah.
And going back to the trope, the savage trope,
The savage trope, yeah,
right?
exactly.
That we need to be educated by Western education. And in this case, they felt that this tribe needed white settlers to teach them how to manage their money.
Right, and was it like what was that saying that they had in the 1800s? It was save the person, kill the Indian,
Mm.
something along those lines. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's like the idea of that we weren't living correctly as human beings, and we needed to be shown how to.
Mm-hmm. And in relation, we do have another article that we definitely encourage our listeners to check out, which is about Black Wall Street and the wealth in African American communities and the violence that they faced when it came to losing that wealth, right? Because a lot of people are not familiar with that history. Just really quickly, it was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and there was a lot of racial violence that was basically enacted to destroy an affluent African American community because they saw it as a threat to white dominated American capitalism. And we were discussing earlier, it's like this country has this mentality all the time of like, work yourself up by the bootstraps. And there are several occasions throughout history when people of color do that and do amass wealth and do even become educated by this Western education, somehow through violence, that wealth is lost and there haven't been any reparations. So I think that's why when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to native art, when it comes to turquoise jewelry and its significance,
Hmm,
right?
hmm.
And you have people that are not native selling turquoise jewelry or making turquoise jewelry. The reason why it's so problematic is because of that pain associated, the historical pain associated. It's like we have so little already when it comes to pass down, and even that you want to take away.
Yeah, and even now our culture is being stripped from its identity and how we pass it on,
Mm-hmm.
and that's our history. And when you mentioned that the Black Wall Street, and we talked about the Osage and them amassing wealth and having something to pass on, that's why when I hear from a lot of people when you bring up this with people who don't understand this perspective, and I'll just put it at that, they don't
Mm-hmm.
understand this perspective, so they're resistant to it. They tend to have an argument just as, why don't you just work hard like everybody else in the
Mm-hmm.
United States and stop complaining and just let people be free? They're not hurting you.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, it's just like, well, yeah, we are hurt because we don't even have that narrative anymore. It's somebody else is taking our culture and telling our stories for us. And in those cases, in some cases, diluting them, not even teaching them correctly, because all of these things have teachings that relate to something functional in life. Like
Mm-hmm.
there is a reason why turquoise is sacred to the natives of the Southwest.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason for it. It's not like superstition, it's experience over
Mm-hmm.
time. So these connections to land, to sacred sites, to each other in
Mm-hmm.
these groups of native people is then stripped when it becomes trendy, when it becomes style.
An aesthetic,
an aesthetic. Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it has definitely become an aesthetic for some people.
And in a way, and I'm just going to bring this up just briefly, the philosopher Slavoj Zizek would probably say that it's become a fetish
Oh
to a
yeah.
lot of Americans. Like it's a
Mm-hmm.
symbol without any meaning anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's why it's important to have these conversations. And we definitely want our audience, like, we want to know, have you ever had like any questions, or you might feel, is this appropriate to do? Am I appropriate in this, or am I appreciated this? Because I think as long as you come with respect with these questions, a community would be willing to answer instead of just demanding that you partake in a culture that doesn't belong to you. And I wanted to bring up, going back to the conversation of Black wealth and Wall Street. Jay-Z has a song called The Story of OJ, and if you ever get to listen to it, the video is really powerful as well, but he basically talks about how even though his experience, he has accumulated a lot of wealth and notoriety, like in the music scene, people still talk down to him because they just see him as a person of color,
Mm-hmm.
but he uses a stronger word, stronger language, right? In the video, basically saying, like, no matter what you do, racist people that do not want to see you move up in this capitalist system that they made,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, there will be a lot of people that try to still diminish those accomplishments. And there's a lot of jealousy as well.
Mm-hmm. Resentment. I mean, and
Resentment.
that's what led to these acts of violence to these groups of people. And the resentment now comes from us even bringing it up to find a way to process and heal as a community.
Yeah, because we're not, see, this is the thing. I think a lot of people, because of how much violence was enacted upon our people, upon Black Americans, upon a lot of marginalized groups in the US, I think people are under the assumption that when we have these conversations, we want to enact violence as well.
Right.
We do not.
No.
We want to heal.
Mm-hmm.
We want to move forward and find appropriate avenues to heal. And one of the appropriate avenues to heal is to have these conversations, as difficult as they are, right? And so I think for our communities, we use art a lot to heal,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's a way to process these feelings and make something beautiful out of other tragedies that we have faced, right? And to move forward, as well as the African American community as well. They use music a lot to heal. And that's why I brought up the song by Jay-Z, because it told like his perspective, and I thought it was really interesting. And then he spoke about the importance of investing, which I thought was interesting. Present day, I did want to bring up a story that happened. This was recent, and it was about Aaron Martinez.
Oh yeah, yeah. In
Yes.
Forney, Texas.
Yeah,
He's
so
a rancher, right?
he was a rancher. He was murdered in cold blood by a man who wanted to drive Hispanics out of Kaufman County. So he was gunned down, and the former mayor, I think, wanted did like a call out about the story because he wanted to label this as a hate crime, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it hadn't been given enough attention. And I think what stood out to me in this story was like, he had just bought that land, and he had children. He raised horses, I believe. He was a rancher.
That's hard work.
And he had been harassed by those neighbors. But again, out of jealousy from his neighbors, he was murdered. And I think that's just very disturbing, because again, we think these acts of violence, right, that are in the past, they're not really in the past. They're in the present, but they don't get a lot of notoriety, or you don't see them on the news a lot. So you don't understand that acts of violence like this are on the daily,
Right.
right?
We have, along with that, we're going to post the link to the website to raise money for this individual.
Yeah, for his family, because it was just a very sad story.
Yeah.
And I just remember that when I read it, I was just kind of like in shock, even though I shouldn't be, right? But I was just in shock that he was just brutally murdered like that.
Right.
You know?
And I appreciate that you are shocked by it, because I don't want to like wake up one day and be desensitized by this and just like, oh, just another person of color killed because of
Mhm.
upward mobility. which
Mm-hmm.
seems to be what they tell us we're supposed to be doing in this country, is working hard, getting a little bit of wealth, and then investing it. And then it's just taken away from us because that's maybe because them telling us this is how you need to act and us resisting it makes confirms their prejudice. But
Mm-hmm.
when we actually do it, it's just like, no, 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 no. Like you're,
Mm-hmm.
I have an idea about who you are, and
Exactly.
that's what I want to believe.
And that goes back to stereotypes and biases,
Yeah.
right? That people hold for people of color and that we constantly have to fight against, right? Whatever the type of biases, like I'm sure that
Hmm.
you growing up, there was a lot of things that you had to fight against about stereotypes.
And yeah, stereotypes, and then also like justifications. Like that's,
Oh,
and I know
okay.
this is one thing that I talked about with my dad on our other show is that it's like the idea is like Native people had, like the West had to be one to for the world to progress where it's at. Like that's the understanding. Like in
Oh,
order for you to have your iPhone, my people had to die. That's what I take from it. You know what I'm saying?
wow.
And
Very entitled.
yeah, very
Hmm.
entitled. And
Very
that's
selfish
and people
perspective.
used to tell me that all the time. It's just
Hmm.
like, what happened to my people is bad. But they're like, well, what were y'all doing with the land? And that's a misconception. The
Yes,
idea that like we didn't know how to farm. No, is we didn't farm in a way that was destructive to the land. And we didn't farm for overabundance.
exactly.
And I say we, in the 70s, native identity became a nationalized thing in the United
Okay.
States. So like when you were talking about like the meaning of turquoise to my people, I don't think it really has that much of a meaning, but
Hmm.
I've learned from other people about what turquoise is and why it's important. And that's why like when you are a native, you have your own people, you have your own traditions. You
Hmm.
don't just go like, well, this is how the Crow do it, and I'm going to do it that way.
Hmm.
Like you have to learn those things
Yeah.
from people. You have to come in with some humility and humbleness. Otherwise, those communities aren't going to teach you anything because they've been burned for so long. And that's another thing is people upset about that. Like, why can't I be accepted in this community? It may have something to do with your insistence in occupying that space.
Hmm.
That's something that's earned.
Hmm.
You don't have a right to that. Like
Yeah.
you don't have a right to that.
Yeah, and I think it might just go back to like a Western mentality
Hmm.
where there's a lot of individualism
Hmm.
instead of like collective
Right.
and community based healing. I definitely like see that here. And I think that's why I wanted to discuss it because spirituality specifically online, there's a lot of like individualistic beliefs that come around spirituality. I'm not going to tell you what to believe or what not to believe because that's your personal path, but
Hmm.
just be careful of where you go for guidance. That's all I'll say.
Well, and I'll also say
Right.
this too, because the personal relationship with God
Mhm.
that Christianity currently has now is a 20th century thing.
Mhm.
It comes from German existentialist philosophers who found that even though we were live we even though Europeans were living their Christian lives at the time, they were discontent with modern capitalism and they were still like depressed and religion wasn't helping them. So these existential philosophers who were Christian came
Mhm.
up with the idea, well, it's your personal relationship with God. You need to cultivate your own personal relationship with
Mm.
God and it's your spirituality. And that's when that mentality and that doctrine started to happen more with evangelism in the United States, but also it kind of spread throughout Christianity throughout the world. And
Mhm.
before that, the Christians were more collective. It was about the congregation.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
and now it's all about your individual relationship with God.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
my philosophy degree helps sometimes.
So, thank you so much to all of our listeners that have shared space with us. And I'm definitely interested to know your perspective if you have ever had any experiences or if you just had any questions. Feel free to post in the comments or you can message us. And thank you so much for joining us in this episode. Have a great day.
This is a prophecy. How Matakwe P.